We recognize that journalists need help. The George Floyd story has not only impacted the citizenry of the United States and even worldwide, but it has had a very significant impact on the journalists who are bearing witness and covering this story. We wanted to bring together medical and mental health professionals to help you as journalists in the media industry better process your reactions to this very significant time in our history. We've gathered together an esteemed panel. We look forward to hearing their insights and useful tips on how you can better manage stress, duress, and cope with current events. Thank you.
So good afternoon. My name is Sarah Vincent, as she mentioned, and I do have a practice where I see a lot of Black professionals. And so the stressors that we are under that are unique and may not be understood by everyone else are things that I sort of deal with as a clinician on a day-to-day basis and just as a Black professional myself. But today, of course, we're focused on Black journalists' mental health. And so we're going to go through in broad strokes what mental health is, stress responses that are common, and when we should be concerned about it actually tipping into mental illness, coping and resilience, and then things that we can do now. So mental health, I think it's always helpful to start these conversations with a definition of what mental health is. Often in the public discourse, it's you're mentally ill or you're not. But mental health is more than the absence of illness. And I like this definition by the World Health Organization that describes it as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own potential, realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And so that is the goal for everyone. Not just that we are not depressed or that we're not anxious or that we don't have a substance use disorder, but that we're actually coping and realizing our potential in our day-to-day lives. So when it comes to Black mental health, messaging is incredibly important, and this is just a brief illustration of why.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and you have 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That was a fairly recent recreation of the Clark doll experiments. And as you saw, what they found in that original study, that there is this internalization that kids have early on about Black being associated with badness that you see. And I play that clip to a group of journalists because it really hammers home how important messaging is and images are, and how early we begin to take those in and what that means for our mental health. So if we go back to that definition about the ability to cope and the ability to contribute to your society, if you have these ideas that are negative, or if other people have these ideas that are negative about who you are just based on how you look, of course that's going to impact your ability to go through the world and realize your potential. The other thing I like to point out with that clip is that it's often shown with Black children, but when you do the same thing with white children, they also have those same associations of white with badness. So as we're thinking about the people we're interacting with in the workplace, the people we may report to, our coworkers, that those things have been internalized by them, often at an early age as well. And so mental health, that general definition certainly applies, but there are other layers of it that come with being a Black member in a society that gives messages that are so powerful that children make those associations really early on. And so we know that when it comes to racism, that has negative impacts on mental well-being, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone, but it's just worth naming that. And it can be whether it is experienced or perceived, that it can have a negative impact. And it can take many forms, interpersonal, societal, institutional, or things that have been internalized. And part of how that internalized racism can show up is imposter syndrome, this idea that the success that you have achieved isn't because you're talented, isn't because you've worked hard. It's because everybody who's promoted you, everybody who's given you a chance, everybody who's given you a position has actually made a mistake, and that you're actually not qualified and skilled enough to be in that place. And this is something that we know affects Black people and women more than other groups of people. The other thing that you can face is that sometimes when you are in a field that doesn't have a lot of people who look like you, or that is run by a lot of white people in positions of power, that some may perceive you as not Black enough because you have to navigate these different spaces. And on the other hand, in some of these spaces, you may get feedback that you are too Black. And so there's this delicate balancing act that we're asked to navigate along with the job responsibilities of whatever your position is, but always having to decide, do I pick that up? Do I take that on? Do I leave that there? And sort of what does that mean for who I am as a Black person in this setting? Trauma, of course, and this has many layers from an intergenerational standpoint, but also from a current trauma standpoint. So we know, as recent events have made evident once again, that we're not in post-trauma when it comes to being Black in American society, that it is an ongoing issue. So when you look at racial trauma from a structural standpoint, we contend with that, but also when you look at studies of things like adverse childhood experiences, Black families bear a disproportionate burden of those, in no small part because of some of the structural racism that they experience as well. Family roles and obligations, and then depending on what your background is, there may also be the added pressure of being the one who made it and people looking to you in a way that extended family members may not be looking to your white colleagues. That can be an additional source of pressure that other people may not understand. So when thinking about journalist mental health, we know that newsrooms are not as nearly as diverse as they should be, that there aren't enough Black people at the table as there should be. But we also know that when you make it and you're that person who gets to that table, that seat can be quite costly. And some of the cost of those opportunities, and first I wanted to start with vicarious trauma. So when people have to talk about or take in traumatic events, even if they weren't there, it can end up impacting them as if they were there or as if that trauma happened to them. And because of what you do in terms of storytelling, unpacking things, having to synthesize information, there's a level of engagement that you have with trauma and with the content that is different. And that level of engagement exposes you to that content in a different way, and introduces a vulnerability to it having an emotional impact on you. You're in a volatile business, which I don't have to tell you, but I just want to point that out, that the uncertainty that comes both personally and professionally with being in a volatile business can certainly be a stressor with a demanding work setting. And then also, even though you're in a field where you are communicators by nature, as Black professionals, sometimes it may feel as if that seat at the table comes at the cost of your voice, or comes at the cost of you having to attenuate your voice. And that can be really stressful too. And so thinking about stress and trauma, in broad strokes, these are things that threaten your safety or your security. And it's important to point out that there's no universal response, but these are some common ways that people may react. It does increase your risk of mental illness. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have it, but we do know it makes you more vulnerable to that, particularly if there's any sort of family history or genetic vulnerability. And that chronic stress in general is incompatible with health. And that's not just mental health, but your physical health as well. So common reactions, things like sadness, fear, worry, anxiety, hopelessness, irritability, muscle pain, headaches, decreased energy, appetite changes, maladaptive coping, sleep impacts, concentration problems, and indecision are all things that you may find yourself experiencing when you're under stress. And on the maladaptive coping, just wanted to point out that this can include anything that you use to cope that on the long run isn't good for you. So we all cope. It's a matter of whether we cope in an adaptive way or a maladaptive way. And sometimes when our adaptive coping mechanisms get overwhelmed, or when we don't have them anymore, like for instance, if you're sheltering in place and you can't go to the gym anymore or go to the restaurant, then we can fall into that maladaptive coping. So when you start to have greater severity of these issues, or they hang around longer, then you want to think about, is this a mental illness? And so some things that could be key indicators, or if the symptoms persist. So if that sadness continues throughout the day or throughout the week or for weeks at a time. If your mood or those symptoms don't respond to the things that you normally do to help you, that could be a sign. Decreased functioning is a big one. And this could be at work or personally. A lot of times when we take pride in what we do, work may be the very last thing to go. So just because you're doing okay at work doesn't mean that you're doing okay. If there are changes in your relationships and in how you're feeling on a day in, day out, or if you're starting to have thoughts of ending your life, those are all red flags that this has gone beyond a stress response and maybe going into mental illness. So when it comes to coping and resilience, we know that there are things that are really helpful, even if we are under stress. And the reality is we are going to be under stress for some time. So it's important to be intentional with these things. So connection is really important. And this speaks to the importance of professional organizations that include people of color who understand the stressors that you're under, both as a Black person and as a journalist. Validation, so being around people who understand your experiences, having a positive racial identity, so one that is not driven by the predominant narrative about who you are as a person of color, but one that is based in the reality of your history and who you are. Movement, so exercise we know has great impact when it comes to your mental well-being. It can be protective around mood and anxiety disorders. And we know that it also helps your physical well-being and your brain functioning. So incorporating that, protecting your sleep, relishing your wins, and pace. So the reality is there will always be another deadline. There will always be another story. There will always be another crisis. And so it's important that you, as the valuable assets to society that you are, guard against burnout. And part of doing that is understanding that this is something we're going to have to do for the long haul. So pacing yourself in that process. And then the last thing on the list is your thing, because in my experience, most people know what they need to do in order to be mentally healthy, or they have some idea of what helps them feel better. They just haven't convinced themselves to prioritize that thing. So whatever that is for you, prioritizing that. So the time is now. And I'll end with a quote by Audre Lorde: "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." We know that you are writing the headlines, but we need you to continue to be on the front lines. And the only way that is possible is if you look out for yourselves as well.
All right. Well, Guys, I'm so happy to see all of you here. And my presentation is actually going to focus in on how to live a happier life covering impactful stories. And I'm so excited that we're having this discussion today because I think it's so important that we do on so many different levels. And especially as a person who values well-being, you're going to find a little bit more about me in a moment. But then also the lens and my why and the value of the research that I'm a part of that can really serve you in terms of crafting a happier life. And then there's also what Dr. Vincent says is about really being intentional. And so this presentation is all about you being proactive and intentional as relates to your well-being. So this is actually a quote or statement, so to speak, that came from RTDNA, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. Of course, you guys know. And I also write for RTDNA. And one of the things I was really proud of seeing was this information that was originally shared by the United Nations, but then also talks about it's okay not to be okay. And I was really drawn to this because as Dr. Vincent talked about so many of the different elements that you can go through in terms of coping and resilience, and then some of the emotions that you may feel. What I value about it is that we really are beginning to have these discussions of the importance of talking about this, and particularly in news, where for years I believe silence was something that was just understood, but now I'm happy to hear that we're making some noise, especially on a management standpoint with RTDNA, and particularly about looking at well-being, valuing well-being, and work-life balance. So I was very happy to see this, but I will tell you this, by this image, I wasn't very okay when I looked at this image. So this is actually an image from my fiance's live hit. So my fiance is a reporter in the Charlotte market, and I screen grabbed this when he was live. And so the image is a little faint, but I think you can kind of make out what's going on, right? And so what's happening is that he's live, this is going on right behind him. A protester actually went and threw a brick at a window. They weren't successful. They crossed the street, and they were met by a group of individuals that actually was holding the protester down by someone saying, "This is not what we're here for." Right? And so they were disappointed, to say the least, that the protester was trying to throw the brick and holding that protester for police. But as a person that is engaged to a journalist, I was sitting here thinking to myself about the well-being of Ken, the well-being of my fiance. And that night was, a very hectic night for him in terms of reporting, working double duty that day. He dealt with a possible brick being thrown at him. So he was dealing with so many different dynamics, but I thought this image said it all. And at that moment, I wasn't okay, even though I will tell you this in terms of my why is having a deeper understanding of my fiance's work, because I'm a former television reporter and news director turned happiness scholar. And so one of the reasons why I think it's important to say that is because it's also the lens that I use in regards to the research that I do in my area, which happens to be positive psychology, which you're going to learn about in a moment. And because of what I was seeing in the industry and in terms of reporting, and especially when I was a news director, in terms of really trying to think about the well-being of my team, I began to focus in on studies within my PhD at the University of Florida. And I will tell you this, that I'm no stranger of going through covering impactful stories or even having an impact in terms of my own life, because when I was early on in my reporting career, I became a widow at 25 years old when I was reporting in Philadelphia. And so that also was, impactful in terms of my life, because of not only dealing with that personally, but then dealing with the fact that at the time my late husband's death made news. So I've seen it on so many different levels, and it was so important for me to focus in on the well-being of our industry, because I think it's important that we have these conversations. So I'm pretty excited that we're going to have this conversation today. So let's talk about positive psychology, and I get pretty excited talking about it. So positive psychology, the image says a lot as it relates to positive psychology, because it's a scientific study of strengths and optimal human functioning that enables individuals and communities to thrive. So for some time, the founders of positive psychology had decided we had focused so much on what's wrong with us. Positive psychology was finding out what is right with us and how individuals thrive. So the movement is about sharing science with a mass audience that can really help them have more meaningful and fulfilling lives. And so it really comes down to how we flourish is one of the terms we use a lot in my research, because it's looking at how do you go about kind of flourishing or bouncing back, as Dr. Vincent was talking about resilience, right? And the importance of resilience. Resilience is all about how do we bounce back? How are we coping and how are we dealing? And what I love about this work is giving us evidence-based strategies that can serve us to help us flourish. So you may say to yourself at this point, well, how can I live a happier life as a journalist? And one of the things I know you've heard a lot about and is trending is self-care, right? Everyone is talking about the value and the impact of self-care. And we're going to talk about self-care. But what I want you to do is I want you to be very intentional and have a proactive approach as it relates to thinking about your overall well-being. And in that case, I want you to think about kind of powering down. I don't want you powering down and shutting down anything right now during this webinar, right? But I want you to think about during moments of self-care is pausing. What can I do right now? I need to pause, I need to slow down, and I want you to be proactive when you do that. And one thing in terms of being proactive is really thinking about your strategy. And so well-being at work serves us. It serves us on an individual and an organizational level. A workplace strategy can really help the performance of an organization. It can lead to reduced levels of illness on the job. It can also build trust and, of course, employee loyalty. So there's various benefits for companies and particularly to focus in on well-being, but it's also important individually. So tip number one, as relates to building and understanding your self-care, is create a well-being strategy. This is you being intentional in regards to what it looks like in regards to your roadmap and plan concerning really your well-being. So again, a well-being strategy promotes health, well-being. Mentioned earlier, it does this individually and as relates to an organization, but it also helps build resilience in your life, right? Because you're being intentional, you're taking some proactive strategies. It's also clear as it relates to objectives, activities, and positive interventions. So part of this presentation today will focus on giving you some positive interventions to focus and to really kind of build and develop the constructs of your well-being strategy. So first, I have to say this in regards to your strategy is really thinking about this on a couple of different levels. One of which is really valuing tip number two, which is positive emotions. So research supports that positive emotions are integral to our well-being. Of course, right? We're thinking about happiness or joy, positive emotions in terms of the dynamic of maybe an event that we are going to, being a celebratory event, or something that has brought us joy in terms of a meaningful event with family and friends. One of the things I want you to keep in mind in terms of thinking about elements that bring positive emotions is really looking at how it's going to serve you individually, right? So it's literally a social experiment in understanding what your needs are and then understanding how you're going to take a proactive approach and what works for you. So I'm going to give you some ideas to hopefully inspire you to kind of begin your own social experiment, but also think deep as it relates to what are some of the things that really serve me in terms of increasing my positive emotions. One of the things I would say is maybe plan a day for yourself. Of course, when we hear about self-care, we think about having a spa day, which is a great thing to do, right? To kind of focus in levels on self. Maybe a picnic, Might be a picnic with friends, or you might decide you want to have a solo picnic and dealing with the stillness of yourself in that moment. And then also thinking about what those hobbies are. You know, what is something that kind of brings you joy and that you really value? I wrote an article some time ago about well-being in terms of how to incorporate a well-being strategy within a natural disaster in newsrooms. And one of the things I mentioned was yoga, right? Yoga, meditation, being mindful, thinking about what can also help you develop even more positive emotions. But what's so important is this, and I hope you remember this, is that be intentional, schedule it, considering it a meeting for self. Right? This is taking a proactive approach in terms of understanding the value and the importance of self-care. And we can increase our positive emotions by really how we think in terms of our past, our present, and even our future. And this actually goes to the benefits of gratitude. So being grateful can teach you the value of kind of looking back on a past event, maybe even looking in terms of a present event, right? But it's being grateful as it relates to what's going on in your life in terms of really looking at the good and looking at the outcomes of where that came from. So research supports this, and one of the things in terms of science is they looked at healthcare workers who were keeping a gratitude diary for about 2 weeks, and it actually reduced perceived stress by 28%. Another thing that it did, it also had a reduction in depression by 16%, and that was writing in a gratitude diary. Also, gratitude has its overall benefit in terms of reducing levels of stress. Of course, we heard a lot about cortisol, right? And that is by 23%. But what's so interesting is that practicing it can also serve you in terms of helping improve your sleep quality. Dr. Vincent talked about elements of sleep, right? It's understanding the value of that in terms of instead of maybe at night when you're thinking about shutting down, that instead of letting your mind wander, you might let your mind think about what you're grateful for. I always tell people it's great to do at the end of the night. It's actually what I do at the end of the night in terms of kind of counting your blessings, right? So it really helps you in terms of understanding the dynamics of what you're grateful for. So one of the things I highly recommend, because I talked about a diary and making some generalizations, but one of the things I do recommend is using a jar. I love it because it allows for a visual component. And it's interesting when I have coached individuals as it relates to leveraging using a gratitude jar, they really enjoy it because they take this and they decide that they're going to make this jar their own. Which you can. This jar that's in the picture is actually a jar that I have in my home that I utilize. A friend of mine who is a former anchor, she loves utilizing her jar in regards to a family activity. So it could be an individual or family activity. But what's so great about it is thinking about what you're grateful for, being in that present moment. And then, as I mentioned, it's great in terms of a shutdown ritual. It literally tells my brain at night when it's time, when I'm thinking about maybe the 3 or even 5 things that I'm grateful for. Okay, I'm turning in. I'm heading to bed. So this activity can be powerful on that level. It can also be powerful on another one too. When my fiance and I were long distance, he would create gratitude jars for me. So he would write about all the things he was grateful for in our relationship. And so it was increasing his levels as it relates to positive emotions by thinking about what he was grateful for in our relationship. And then every time I read it, it was increasing positive emotions for me. So this is an interesting dynamic in terms of really valuing gratitude. And I will tell you this, when I was reporting, I was pretty grateful for some moments where I would cover some hard-hitting stories and looking back on what I was grateful for at that moment, especially during a time when I was going through so much tough times in regards to being a widow. So it's really a great activity on so many different levels. So remember this in terms of the benefits of gratitude and really the science of it all. Another great tip is tip number 3, which is positive relationships. And I always like to qualify relationships, not simply relationships in terms of a generality, but really focusing on the impact and the importance of positive relationships. And relationships are really central to our well-being. The time we spend in relationships can bring us joy, laughter, again, positive emotions, belonging, meaning, and accomplishment, which is really, I see it as such a great kind of double impact, so to speak. APA talks about the value of good connections, but what's so wonderful is that in terms of building your well-being strategy is valuing both meaning, the meaning in terms of the connection with friends, and also the level of accomplishment as well. So there's so many benefits in terms of the value of positive relationships. So a positive intervention is, I like to call it, we all have the hashtag, this relationship goals, and we talk about the value of those goals. Well, I will tell you this, I really believe in the impact and the value of self-care squad goals. All right, so keep that in mind, self-care squad goals. And so research suggests that accepting help and support by those who care for you will strengthen your resilience, right? So important in terms of how we bounce back. And you can find that in organizations, from your professional organizations. I've been a proud member of NABJ for over 20 years, and it's been great seeing a level of community within our organization, as well as other organizations that I'm a part of. You can find that with also faith-based organizations, but also your newsroom. One of the things that I treasure about news is the level of family I always felt working in a newsroom, and how I leaned on many of my co-workers and how we leaned on each other. Then also clearly family and friends. But this is where the qualifier comes in, right? Because I just didn't say any relationship, I said positive relationships, is understanding who these individuals are, identify them, and then search for people who are empathetic, who value perspective taking, who are good active listeners. It really is someone that really truly understands the thoughtfulness in regards to how they may share information, right? So there's so much value in regards to thinking about, again, those self-care squad goals. And I will say this, another great example is I have a couple of friends, we do this tech support, and so we have an understanding. That's the interesting part about when you identify individuals. It's the fact that you've discussed this, hey, I think it'd be great if we're there for each other as it relates to, it's usually implied in a friendship, but I always think it's great when you discuss it. And so we've discussed these ground rules of, hey, we do this text support. There's no judgment. If you want to send a text at 3 a.m. just to talk, to get something off your chest, that's fine. And it's always understood that someone's going to reply, and that in that whole correspondence between us, it's so much empathy and really just no judgment. So it's about thinking about and being mindful of those relationships. Tip 4 is self-compassion. And the science of self-compassion is really impactful because it's really thinking about self-kindness, right? When we think about compassion, we may think about how we're focusing on someone else's suffering. Well, self-compassion is inward. Is focusing on treating yourself the same way you would treat another person suffering. And I think that's very important, especially when you're in a world fast-paced like news and you're covering different stories, and you may say, gosh, I could have covered this story better, right? It's thinking about your self-talk. So when you're having a difficult time, you may deal with maybe levels of failure, or you may notice a difference in yourself. You need to stop and say, and it's the value of self-compassion is, how can I comfort and care for myself at this time? What do I need right now that's going to serve me? It really gives you a moment to think about and reflect on what you need and addressing those needs, which are so important and impactful. So the positive intervention I want you to think about is from one of the leading scholars in self-compassion. Her name is Dr. Christian Neff, and she has an activity called How Would You Treat a Friend? And one of the things to kind of briefly walk you through it, she has you really think and write your responses out, but really kind of thinking through what that interaction looks like. Think about the times when a close friend feels bad or is struggling, and then how would you respond to that friend? But then another question is, how about when you feel bad about yourself? And these are very important questions because sometimes we may find ourselves harder on ourselves. And so what this does, it allows you to understand how would you respond, and responding with the same love, compassion, and empathy that you would do someone else, that you're going to now do for yourself. This is a really important exercise. And again, Dr. Christian Neff is phenomenal in regards to her work in this area. So I'm going to give you guys a bonus tip. And this is something that is important, especially if there's managers on this call. But then also, this is something that I think it needs to be a continued discussion in our industry in general. And that is really how important compassionate news leaders and how they can help. And so I just recently wrote an article for RTDNA focusing on the value of compassion in newsrooms. And I got a message from journalists, and one in particular told me, I really like what you're sharing here, Courtney, in regards to talking about this. I hope it spreads. Because it's so important that it spreads. I think today on this call, we can really work on spreading this message, because it's important, because it's not simply a great headline. Science supports compassionate operations and compassionate companies. And when a company does practice this, they are, contributing to psychological safety with their employees. It actually increases creative ideas and innovation, which is something really important in our field. It focuses on employee wellness, and it's good for recruitment and retention, because if a person is treated well, then of course they're going to want to continue to stay. But what's also very important is how empowering it is for an individual who's working in an organization like that, and then also focusing on the construction of their well-being strategy, because that manager has a well-being strategy for the team, and now you are a part of that, and then on top of the fact that you have one for yourself as well. So important. And I hope you take a look at that article, and I hope we can spread the word together. So last but not least, my tip is tip number 5, and it is ask yourself, do I need professional help? So when I worked on the article and started researching how to implement a well-being strategy in newsrooms, I talked to a clinical therapist who actually used to be a news producer. And so she recommended this. So when you begin to really not feel yourself, or you're shying away from stories, shying away from events in the newsroom, she highly recommends seeking professional help, especially if it's continually replaying, if you're ruminating about this. And of course, we've talked about this in the news, but we've also talked about this in a general sense, but how some may view mental health. And in the terms of mental health treatment serving as a stigma, but this can hinder really getting the help that you need. Taking care of yourself is the most important thing you can do. When I personally, I talk about this, I think it's important that people hear this from me, because I'm a happiness scholar, and also because of the fact that I am African-American female, and I speak a lot about the value of therapy. When I was working as a journalist in Philadelphia and I returned back from bereavement leave, my first story I covered was a funeral assigned by my news director. And I think I was able to handle it as well. I was able to handle it under the circumstances because of the help that I received in terms of therapy. So remember, the most important job you have is a job you have to take care of yourself. And so I want you to also remember that self-care isn't selfish. Remember that you can't serve from an empty cup. My mentors always remind me, you serve from your saucer, not your cup. That's why it's important to be proactive, to always fill it. And I hope you consider this presentation really your permission slip to be human, to do just that, but also now to have some proactive strategies to really help you develop your self-care needs. And so I'm going to end it with this quote of the day, really a quote to live by. And this is Dr. Christian Neff, which I've talked about in this presentation. She says, unlike self-criticism, which asks if you're good enough, self-compassion asks, what's good for you? And I think it's important to say that across the board is being really in touch with what you need and thinking about some evidence-based strategies and doing your own social experiment to find out what's really going to serve you. It's important that you schedule it just like you schedule any meeting that you may have in the newsroom. So guys, I would love for us to keep in touch. This is my contact information. Feel free, you can follow me on my Facebook page, which is Dr. Courtney Alston. I'm on Instagram, I should say, as the Happy Researcher, Twitter at Dr. Courtney Alston, and you can always visit my website where I have a lot of different resources, and particularly pertaining to positive psychology. And so I'm going to end it with this note. I'm pretty grateful for our time together. I'm looking forward to find out what's going to serve you in regards to covering these tough stories.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you to have this shared experience. I applaud you all for the work you do, being there on the front line, bringing us news as it's happening, and helping us to make sense out of what's going on. It's hard when for people in your profession, when there's a president in the White House who is always bad-mouthing the press, doesn't respect you, doesn't respect the work that you do. So again, thank you. Thank you for all you do. Today, I want to talk to you about duress. I want to share some tips for coping in times of duress. Okay, duress is different from stress. The previous speakers, Dr. Vincent and Dr. Austin, talked about stress, but I want to talk about duress. Duress is defined as threats, violence, constraints, or other action brought to bear on someone to do something against their will or better judgment, okay? So it's different than stress. It's different than that stress that we have on a daily basis that we're experiencing, having to sit in rush hour traffic, having to rush to get to an appointment, having to rush to make a flight, and those unexpected things that come up, like getting a flat tire as you're on your way to work, that's stress. But duress is a little different. So I want to share these tips with you. How do you cope when things are really bad? How do you cope when they're really bad, and how do you manage your fight-flight response? Okay. Oops. Okay, so here are the tips. Express your feelings, know your limits, talk to someone you feel comfortable sharing your feelings with, understand your role, understand your job, what you're there to do, and try to leave work at work. So to delve into these a little more, and my cursor is not moving. Okay, there we are. Okay, so the first tip I want to talk about more in depth is expressing your feelings. Knowing, being able to understand that your feelings are real and valid. And what I mean by that, you might have 3 individuals who have the same situation and respond and react differently. You take myself, a Black man, I'm pulled over by a police officer, and the thought that goes through my head is, am I going to make it out alive? Is there going to be violence involved? Whereas another individual of a different culture might be concerned about whether or not they're going to get a ticket and whether or not their insurance premium is going to increase. Okay, then take the third individual, an undocumented person driving and is pulled over, and their concern is whether or not they're going to be deported. Okay, so there are three different sets of feelings for the same type of situation. Everyone's feelings are real and everyone's feelings are valid. Okay. All right. Okay. Second, know your limits. Know when you need to tap out. Situations occur, they could become heated, they could become unsafe. You need to know when you can't take it anymore and you need to step out or step away. It's nothing wrong with, leaving for a bathroom break, leaving the situation altogether. Sometimes you might have to use those skills where you just have to dissociate or maybe daydream for a minute, but know that it's okay and know that in order to take care of yourself, sometimes you have to take a break and you need that time out. All right. Talking to someone is very important. And I think both of the doctors before me stressed this as well. Having someone that you feel comfortable sharing your feelings with. Family is great. Talking to your spouse, talking to your partner, talking to a friend, talking to mom, but sometimes you need to talk to someone who has a shared experience, someone who's in the same profession or field, someone who knows what it's like to do the work that you do. Find a buddy, find someone you can talk to and share. It could be that both of you are covering the same story or covering a similar story, and you take time after to debrief. Let's talk about what happened out there. Let's kind of process, let's try to process this together. And again, when you're looking for someone to talk to and someone to be supportive, don't go to that individual who wasn't supportive in the past, never has been supportive, that individual who's negative, right? You want to really find someone who is going to allow you to talk about what's going on, and also someone who's going to listen to what you have to say. All right. One second here. Okay, hold on one second. Okay. You want to understand your role in the situation. You have a job to do, you have to cover a story. You need to be there in the moment, doing what you were sent there to do, remembering what the goals were for you, being there to cover the story that you need to. I have a story that I want to share with you that I wish I could say it was a funny story or a happy story, but it isn't. I used to do private practice in Baltimore, Maryland. I was working with a client who had experienced some anxiety. She was unable to um, drive because she was in a car accident, hit from behind, and wasn't able to drive anymore, wasn't able to get behind the wheel. And so I had to help her, deal with this anxiety because it was causing problems for the rest of her life. Um, and she came into the session one day and she said, I can't talk about the anxiety stuff today. I need to talk to you about a pressing family matter, right? So I said, okay, have a seat, let's talk, what's going on? She said, my 17-year-old daughter is dating a Black guy, another student. He's an A student. He's student body president. He's a great kid. I said, okay, so what's the problem? She said, when my daughter went to have a conversation with my husband and I about this relationship, my husband immediately got up, went to the back door, opened the door, and vomited. Came back into the house and said to my daughter, I'm disgusted. Now I'm sitting across from this woman and I'm saying to myself, does she not know that I'm Black? But in that moment, I had to pull myself together. And for the next 45 minutes, I had to be a therapist to this woman. I had to listen to what was going on in her family. I had to help her process the situation. But it was very hard. I don't think that she noticed that it affected me. And actually, the week after, she ended up bringing her daughter into the session for a family meeting. But I was at a point of, I was, in disbelief. I initially thought that, maybe this was a joke, but it wasn't. It was real. So again, in these situations, we it's important that you remember and remind yourself that you're there to do a job. I need to do this job. After the job is done, I can go and debrief with others. I can go and talk to someone else about what's going on. But for now, I need to do my job. Okay. And finally, I can't stress this enough. Try to leave work at work. I know some of you don't have 9-to-5 jobs where you clock in at 9, clock out at 5, but you need to find time for self-care to take care of yourself. If you have one of those schedules where you work off and on periodically during the day, please schedule time for self-care, schedule time to take care of yourself.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. Let me just first begin by thanking you for putting this together. I think it is incredibly important for us to have this discussion specific to Black journalists, and that will be helpful, but also that allies can maybe learn from to help support Black journalist colleagues or teams. So thank you so much for putting this together. And I want to thank Dr. Alston, Dr. Vincent, and Mr. Presley for, giving up time on a Sunday. I can tell you when we reached out to them, every single every single one of the panelists responded immediately and was like, this is an essential topic that we need to talk about. And this is help that Black journalists need. And absolutely, we will be part of this panel. And so thank you so much for doing this. This has been incredibly insightful. I do not want to stand in the way of a Q&A session because I think that there are some important questions that need to be asked and answered, and that that there's important guidance to provide. I will say that I have been a journalist of color in the US for about 15 years, and that everything that you feel is valid, and it is important to lean on each other and our networks. And I know that there are a lot of other discussions and actions that need to be taken about newsroom diversity, but I just want to specifically address the fact that we need to lean on each other. We understand each other's experience, and how you're feeling right now is okay. I have spoken to so many journalists in the past few weeks who have said to me that they're not sure if they can do their job or how can they focus through this. And I don't really have an answer. All I can say is that I feel the same way. I have days that I'm shut down, and I just want to say, if you lean on your networks and embrace is a strong word, but accept how you're feeling as valid. Don't question that, and give yourself space to feel how you're feeling. But at the end of the day, you are the best one to tell your story. And give yourself space for that and honor that. And thank you for being here, and thank you for doing the work that you are doing, because it is not easy, and you are appreciated, and you are seen, and your communities need you. So thank you. Thank you. So that's it from me. I'm going to toss it back to Sarah, and I'm hoping that we can have a great Q&A with our panel, and they can share some insights with us that will help us sort of navigate through the past few weeks since 4.5 centuries. So no pressure, but you guys, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Dr. Patrice Harris is the 174th president of the American Medical Association, first Black female president of the esteemed organization. And she's also a psychiatrist based in Atlanta. And we're happy to say that she has been such an important mental health professional and medical leader that we've watched. As journalists, we've covered her and we've interviewed her since the dawn of her term last year, but then most recently getting through this pandemic that has touched us so significantly, the Black community and communities of color. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Harris, for your leadership and your knowledge transfer. So we look forward to hearing from you tonight on this particular topic and what Black journalists can do to support themselves and support their colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming tonight and taking care of yourselves. I really have often said over the course of my career, particularly when I was leading organizations, that words matter and clarity counts. Now, I don't have to convince this particular audience of the importance of words and clarity. But I will tell you that even the title of this evening's event is powerful. First of all, wellness is in the title. And I think for far too long, and still in some circles, when we think about mental health, we think that mental health is synonymous with mental illness. even such words. And I know that you all as journalists don't use those words, but I know that I have heard so many times when someone would say, do you think it might be a good idea to talk with a therapist or talk to a psychiatrist? I have heard, I don't need to talk to a psychiatrist. I'm not crazy. So unfortunately, although thanks to you all and a lot of folks, this is changing, although not as fast as we needed to in the Black community. So maybe we can talk about that later and how we can continue to make sure that the perception that you have to be ill or crazy, I'm using that, see it in air quotes, to seek help. So I think wellness is perfect. And is great that is that in that title. And then the other issue is check-in, because you know what that does? It routinizes, right? Service seeking and help seeking. It means that you don't have to have experienced an out of the ordinary event, or you don't have to have out of the ordinary symptoms or problems to seek help. We should routinize help seeking. One of the things I'll just briefly mention, I'll probably come back to this a little earlier, is folks on the front line, as journalists are, but physicians on the front line. We've been talking a lot about that, especially in emergency departments and ICU units in New York. We're, of course, faced with a new virus, a lot of death, standing in sometimes as surrogates for family, and not having a place originally to deal with all this. How do you deal with it as physicians? And I think I'll say this a little later too. As I was thinking about tonight, I was thinking about the similarities with physicians, particularly physicians on the front lines and journalists covering this, but also those who are witnessing this from afar. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But at the end of a shift, it was very important for nurses and doctors to sort of check in with one another and debrief that shift. How are you feeling? And certainly it was critical to routinize this. You can tell me this, I don't know about journalists in general, but I can tell you that as physicians and nurses and health professionals, we are often so busy taking care of others. Women have this too, that we forget to take care of ourselves, right? And so again, the importance of tonight, but that happens a lot in healthcare. And so routinizing that in ICU, emergency department, hospitals, for everyone on the front line. We won't talk about this probably as much tonight, but you know, the essential workers who drove the bus and made sure we received groceries and all of the things that we need. I worry that they didn't have and still don't have an outlet, right? A routine wellness outlet. So again, not the focus of tonight's call, but something I think about a lot as we get through this pandemic and think about the mental health needs in general on the other side of this. So again, words matter, as this group knows. So I want to first talk about the universal and then maybe get down to some specifics, but self-care and the need for self-care is universal. And so the first thing I want to say, and you probably heard this the last time, but it is important to repeat, we have to give ourselves grace to feel whatever we are feeling. Too often, and certainly in the midst of something, in the midst of covering a story, in the midst of working with patients in the hospital, at that very moment, you might not have the opportunity to even think about your feelings, but later, when you might be alone or when you might not have support, or when you're debriefing either alone or with others, we do have to give ourselves grace, not beat ourselves up for feeling however we are feeling. And I think that's important. And I will say this now in the general, and I think it's even more so in the specific when we talk about us as Blacks in this country. It is okay not to be okay. And let me share this with you, because I've always thought I need to be authentic. I am on that journey too, right? I am a psychiatrist. I have a lot of experience in this, but I still have to give myself grace to not be okay. I shared about a month ago with some colleagues that, you know what? I am not okay. The Black people in our organization are not okay. And let's figure out what we need to do to reach out to make sure they have the support that they need. Now, I wasn't saying that I wasn't okay personally. I'm a physician. I have privilege in this country, not privilege that everyone has, but I do have some privilege. I have been able to work from home. I can afford takeout, right? I can afford groceries. I have a car. I have all of those things that are privileged. And even among that, I have not been okay lately. Not necessarily me personally, but worried and thinking about our community. And so it is okay not to be okay. Then we have to sort of take those feelings and move those feelings into action at some point. But we definitely need to give ourselves grace to feel how we feel. The other thing I want to say is we need to manage and monitor our expectations. I am not a mother, so I didn't have to worry about educating children, or I'm not a parent. So I know some of you on this call are. So you're working hard first on COVID, and then as we quickly, fortunately, realized the disproportionate impact on African Americans, we had to struggle through that and tell that story. You ought to tell that story. We had to figure out how to tell that story. And you're educating your children. My father does live here in Atlanta, and he is a senior. He lives independently, but still I had to worry about my dad. And so many of us are in that sandwich generation where we are caring for children and then caring for parents, or as we do in our community, right, caring for grandmothers and aunts and uncles. And so we have to certainly manage and monitor expectations and realize, and I hope everyone quickly realizes, especially those with parents. I'm a child psychiatrist, so I had a lot and still do have respect for parents, but it is impossible, I think, you all can tell me, to educate children in the manner that they would have been educated at school. And so certainly I loved it when the first parent said, you know what, I give up. No, this is not working out well. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm not sure we're going to get through the lesson plans today that the teacher has set. So we certainly need to manage our expectations. Let me just talk in general a couple more that are important. I think you know them, but we should always repeat. We need to make sure we exercise and move. Again, I always talk about if you are not a person of privilege and you don't have a safe neighborhood to walk in, put on your favorite record. For me, it's Frankie Beverly and Mays, and dance around your house. But we do need to move, and especially when we're sitting at desk all day, on Zoom calls, we certainly need to make sure that we get up and get some exercise. And we need to try to bring back routines in our lives and lives of our family members. We need to stay connected. We have been, of course, appropriately physically distancing. You may have heard me say this several times in the media. I try not to use the term social distancing. I'm sort of sorry that that was the term that we started out with, because we needed to physical distance, but certainly we need to still maintain that social connection. Fortunately, we do have opportunities like this. But you know what I said to some folks, and my dad is not tech savvy. He doesn't have a data plan. He struggled with an iPad. So, sometimes we have to do what we used to do, or at least I used to do. I'm older than I think everyone on this call, is pick up the phone and call people, right? And I think we also got into the habit of even texting rather than calling. And I hope, and I think tonight again with this Zoom call, but we should call one another more and listen and hear one another's voice, and see one another. And I think, that is, there's a promise and peril of Zoom and video conferencing, but one promise and one good thing is the ability to see faces and listen to one another and hear someone else's voice, and occasionally have a glass of wine or a cocktail with your evening Zoom meetings, as long as your work is done. We need to work on sleep as best we can. I know my sleep has been disrupted some, but as best we can. And then call on our usual coping skills: pray, meditate, yoga, be still and quiet. I think that is important. I do that every morning. Now, at first I do that for me and I get centered. And then the next thing I do is review the number of people that we have lost in this country. I think as the leader of the American Medical Association, that was important. We talk a lot about science and data in the medical field, and that is important. But you know what? There are families behind every one of the lives that we have lost. And that goes even more for the families of those who've been recently killed at the hands of police, or at the hands of those who think they are the police. And so we have to make sure that we take a moment and pause. And so every moment I do, and I think about that, to make sure that I'm centered on the work that I have to do for the rest of the day and the stories that I have to tell. Fortunately, the media has allowed me to tell some of those stories. Now, how about the next one? Take a break from the media. You guys, you are the media. You do this every day. How do you take a break from the work that you do? But that is important. And I wanted to make sure that I was informed and kept up to date and knew what everyone was saying. And so I was constantly watching cable news. But at some point, I needed a break. I mean, I would go to a studio and cable news is on, and come back from the studio, cable news is on. And after a moment, I said, you know what? You need to take a break. And so I began I'm a sports fan, big sports fan. And I started to listen to my favorite sports talk radio. I needed to take that break. Now, let me quickly get to the specific, and then I'll turn it over. Black, as I said earlier, Black people are not okay with all that is going on. It started with disproportionate impact of COVID. And then for me here in Georgia, it was Mr. Arbery. And then it was Miss Taylor. And then it was Mr. Floyd. And the comment that I've heard the most often is Black people are exhausted. And I know I am exhausted. And I know many of you, we are just exhausted. And so I think, and I want to hear this in discussion, I think Black professionals many have decided, number one, mothers told me they could not watch the tape of Mr. Floyd. It was just too hard. Mothers talk about the stress day in and day out of racism, the trauma of racism, and knowing, again, not only these huge incidents, but that those day in, day out micro insults. And also the editing. I imagine that all of you in meetings, sometimes we are always editing, right? What we say and what we do. And we think about the strategic time to say one thing. I don't know about you, but I have decided to edit. I was going to say just a little less, a lot less. And I think this is a time for all of us as professionals and again, each one of us will have individual decisions to make on this, but I'm hearing that from a lot of folks. We have a lived experience in this, and I think that's what makes our work harder, your work harder. It's not just a story, and I'd be interested in hearing how you all deal with this, because you are covering a story, but for us, for Black people, it's not just a story. Either we've experienced it ourselves or someone we know has experienced something. I will tell you, just yesterday was the anniversary of the church shooting in South Carolina. And I am very close to someone who was very close. And I knew as well one of the women who were killed, murdered. And I don't know about you, and I think this is all in what we have to deal with as African Americans, as Black people, professionals. I remember the videotape of when they arrested Dylan Roof. And if you contrast that with some of the arrests that we have seen that ended in the death of Black people in our community, that is a gut punch, right? And what about you're walking, you're having a great time in a city, and you walk by one of those statues and you read the inscription, and you see that it is glorifying someone from the Civil War. And that is a gut punch to who you are. So these are all the experiences on the individual level that I think all African American professionals are feeling. And I think we have to talk about it. We have to have venues like this. And the last thing I'll say is what Sarah said. And I alluded to this earlier. There is still stigma, particularly in the Black community. And so we have to do our best to make sure that it is okay to ask for help. So a certain level of stress and distress, and these feelings are normal, but if these feelings begin to impact your ability to function, that's when it's okay to ask for professional help. And I hope that we encourage one another to do that at the appropriate time. And so I will end with that, and then I look forward to questions later in the presentation.
You so much, Sarah. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so honored to be able to talk to you all about really how Black journalists can maintain happiness. As Sarah mentioned, that I'm a happiness scholar, and I'm actually a television reporter, news director turned happiness scholar. And I actually made that transition with seeing some of the things that were happening in the industry and really felt that we needed to address issues to not only in terms of helping in terms of well-being, but to also make sure we're thinking about the level of happiness amongst teams and organizations in the industry. So let's get started. And I will say this, that one thing I really treasured Dr. Harris's presentation, talking about how it's okay not to be okay. And, you know, I'm not sure if you remember when you were children, right? And we would have to go home and the school would give us a permission slip and we would get it signed by a parent. I actually believe sometimes we need that as an adult permission slip in terms of giving ourselves permission to be human, to go through any of the emotions that we need to go through. Within my International Positive Psychology Association community, this is one of the things that were shared. And one of the things I really valued about that is the importance of really the humanness of it all, right? Giving ourselves permission to feel whatever we need to feel. So if you need that permission today, I want you to utilize this slip, because it's just for you. So let me talk a little bit about my research, and then I'm going to go right into what we can do in terms of some coping strategies. So within my research, I've talked to journalists, and I've talked to media entrepreneurs, and I really want to share some of the qualitative data, especially as it related to perceptions of work satisfaction amongst journalists. And of course, I've heard things in terms of lacking resources, lacking diversity, burnout. I'm thinking about making a transition out of the industry. But out of all the things that I've heard, I thought that would be really an important point to make tonight is that comment in the middle. And it says, as a reporter, you're never off, right? As a journalist, you're constantly on. And so one of the reasons I mentioned that, because when you're constantly on, you're constantly in motion, it's difficult to even think about, well, how am I going to think about my self-care? Look, when I'm home, Courtney, I'm looking at the news, I'm thinking about my next story, I'm thinking about what I'm going to pitch, I'm maybe even responding to elements as it relates to work. So it's important that we acknowledge that, but also it's important that we talk about what we can do to intentionally practice self-care. I also want to share this, because when we talk about the importance of self-care, it's about looking at, as Sarah was talking about earlier, the dynamic that's happening in the industry. I really love this article that was published by The Hollywood Reporter. And it talked to 10 Black journalists, and in regards to George Floyd, and in terms of coverage, but also in terms of diversity. One of the things that really stood out was the headline alone. When we look at it, I have struggled, right? And so knowing this and understanding this and really unpacking this is important, that we look at it, we evaluate it, but what can we do? What can we do in terms of coping and handling these matters that are going to help maintain our well-being? Within that article, just some highlights. It talked about one journalist experiencing the N-word, another journalist being confused as a hotel maid on a story, which is another element to having to unpack. But I thought really this quote was really another thing that was beneficial. It's been emotionally exhausting, right? emotionally exhausting, and it's been emotionally draining. And when you get to that point, you really need to start thinking about, okay, what am I going to do in terms of my well-being? How am I going to make sure I protect myself from burnout? And hopefully also think about some proactive strategies where you may not get to that point. I also want to share something on a personal note. So dealing with the level of racial stress, we saw that in the article with the Hollywood Reporter. I will tell you that it touches me at home. So I'm a former television reporter, news director, now turned happiness scholar, but I'm engaged to a journalist who has been here in the Charlotte market for 21 years, who is a part of NABJ's national board and is constantly working in terms of service and also working as it relates to really serving the community. And of course, you guys know what that role entails. This is something that literally, if you want to talk about something that's breaking news, this is something we talked about last night. And as a couple, Ken actually encouraged me to share it with all of you today. So here he is covering a story as it relates to the Confederate statue here in Gaston County. And these are some of the responses that he received on social media. And I'm not going to read them at length. You guys can kind of take a glimpse at some of them. One of the statements says, "I'm a redneck country girl." Yeah, that N word. So obviously imposing more racial stress. But we see a dynamic here, right? So it's not simply just covering a story, but it's also the dynamics of what one is encountering. And of course, you guys know this in terms of online and also online harassment. So I'm here to tell you that positive psychology can serve you. And it served Ken and I, and I'm going to tell you about a little bit more how we unpacked it as a couple when I talk a little bit about coping with racial stress. But positive psychology can serve you because positive psychology, which is a part of my area of research, deals with really the strength and optimal human functioning that enables individuals and communities to thrive. It's really about human functioning and how we flourish. And what I love about the movement is about sharing more science with a mass audience to really help them have a more, not just a happier life, but a more meaningful life and a fulfilling life. So one of the things that positive psychology does, but what I think is also important to mention, especially on this call, because we're focusing on Black journalists and media professionals, right, are the shared values of African Americans and positive psychology. So many of the strengths recognized in positive psychology, such as optimism, hope, well-being, courage, forgiveness, benevolence, are really emphasized as core values within our community. And these are findings that researchers have found in this area. And I think it's important to share that because one of the elements of positive psychology is not focusing on what's wrong with us, but what's right with us. How are we responding? How are we building resilience? How are we coping? So you're probably saying, well, let's talk about how I can practice self-care. Right? So let's talk about that. What does it look like? How can we continue to unpack this? It's about being intentional. And when I say be intentional, it's about creating a well-being strategy. During our last session that we had, I guess a couple of weeks ago now, it's hard to tell these days with the pandemic. But I talked about the value of a good well-being strategy, what it means for an individual, what it means to an organization. But really, one of the things I want you to walk away with is really understanding the value of thinking proactively about what you can include and what you can use and utilize and kind of pull out of your toolkit, so to speak, in terms of helping you cope and helping you kind of build your approach to your self-care. So the last time I talked about positive relationships, positive emotions, which is all about how do we go about increasing those emotions within certain activities, which we're going to talk about in a moment as well. Self-compassion was another element that was discussed because self-compassion is very important because it will help you understand the value of being kind to yourself. Because also what can happen when we're going through stressful situations, we may may start blaming ourselves and having this self-critical talk. Self-compassion is all about really being kind to yourself. One of the things I did share, and I know Sarah is working on sharing the video from the last webinar, was the value of really being a friend to yourself, right? How would you treat a friend, and what that looks like, and how do you go about that kind of that self-talk, and in terms of being a kind of a good bestie to yourself, and then making sure that you are surrounded by, I call it a self-care squad. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we're dealing with coping as it relates to racial stress. So let's talk about it. So proactive coping with racial stress. I will say this, I really valued finding more strategies as it relates to what we can do in terms of coping, especially during this time, by Dr. Monica Williams, who actually infused not only looking at racism and racial stress, but infusing elements of positive psychology as it relates to her coping strategies. What I loved earlier, what Dr. Harris was sharing, I kept on shaking my head and smiling a lot as she was talking, because I was like, yes, she's right. And was that she mentioned limitations, right, in terms of our exposure. She talked about social media. And what Dr. Williams recommends is a limit exposure to racial stress. In this case, you may be signing off of social media. Now, that can be a little difficult to do. We just saw one quote talking about how, when I'm a reporter, I'm never off. When I was a reporter, it was very challenging for me. I just, never stopped. But you have to find some time where you have to think about, how am I going to recharge so I can go and to kind of have a better set of eyes. I've always rationalized it like this. I need a good night's rest. No, I need to actually go and listen to what my body's telling me now, and just kind of shut down so I can rejuvenate myself. So begin to think about what that looks like. Maybe it may start with an hour or 2 hours. Maybe start small and see what you can realistically do. But if you're looking at messaging the way that my fiance is looking at messaging, and unfortunately other journalists that are suffering looking at some messaging in terms of online harassment, you do want to limit your exposure. So community was another element that she recommended. She talked about family, friends, professional organizations. One of the things I love so much about being a member of NABJ for all of these, almost 20 years now, being a member of NABJ, is because of the great sense of family and community that we have within the organization and within other professional journalism organizations as well. And also faith-based organizations, right? In terms of being able to find that sense of community. But what's really, I want to qualify that, is really talking about the value of positive relationships. When we have good relationships, that is really a great indicator as relates to our well-being. And I say positive because I think it should be qualified, right? Because you want people that are empathetic, that value active listening, and allow you to be seen. So to go back to the time that Ken and I were processing and talking as a couple as related to these comments, I asked him, I said, when you talk with me about it, I said, because I'm a happiness scholar, I've worked in the industry. I said, do you feel a greater sense of peace, or do you feel a little bit more relief in terms of your well-being unpacking it with me? Or would you feel just as comfortable talking about it with someone who is not in the industry? And one of the things I really valued about what he shared was this. He goes, I enjoy talking about it with you because you understand what my day looks like. So it's great to be able to talk about it with someone who understands my day. He goes, but then I can also be able to unpack it. Someone may not understand my day. He said, but one of the key elements is a person being compassionate. So that's also important to think about, is when you're sharing information, what that looks like and how the person is processing, and really that level of compassion and really that level of empathy. She also suggest spiritual practices, which are also great in terms of really with your well-being. And I know Dr. Harris also kind of shared elements of that as well in her presentation. Another thing that she recommended was seeking distractions. And what I like is how she qualified that. It wasn't about not acknowledging what's happening, but seeking some distractions that are about engaging in positive activities. And so that is what we're going to talk more about today, to kind of arm you with even more tools about some positive activities that you can unpack and start even more through your toolkit. One of them happens to be gratitude. There's benefits to gratitude. Of course, we've heard a lot about it. I love that Oprah talked a lot about it on her shows, right, in terms of having a gratitude journal. And actually, research supports that. So there's a study that found that a group of healthcare practitioners who kept a gratitude journal for 2 weeks, they saw a decrease in their perceived stress by 28%, also depression 16%, but it helps also with overall stress in terms of lowering our cortisol levels. And then also it can help, this is one of the reasons why I practice it at night, it can help with sleep quality. But this is another great element for you to think about in terms of self-care, that you can begin to think, okay, how can I go about maintaining levels of my well-being? What can I do to maintain some happiness? I'm going to practice, gratitude and think about what that looks like. And so there's a variety of different gratitude activities, but today we're going to do one together. All right. So this is what I want you guys to do. Feel free if you want to use your cell phone, if you have your iPad, if you have a pen and paper close by, anywhere where you can actually write. I want us to walk through very quickly a gratitude exercise so it can give you even more insight about the principles of gratitude. So this one is about celebrating goodness. And so what I want you to do right now, we need to think of 3 things that went well for you. I'm not going to put a time frame on it. Could have been today. It could have been yesterday. Could have been last week. I want you to think of 3 things that went well for you. I want you to think about what that looked like. I want you to think, why are you choosing that? Meaning, why did it go well? All right, I want you to identify that. And I want you to begin writing it down. I'm going to give you a moment to do that. And while you are unpacking it, I'm going to kind of walk you through kind of the thought process so it can also help you when you're practicing gratitude for things for you to think about. All right, so now you've probably thought about 3 things, and if you didn't, that's okay. If you thought about 1 thing, that's fine. Let's focus in on just that one. All right, now I want you to think about what went well. Then I want you to think about, how did it make you feel? Were you happy? Did it bring you joy? Was there laughter involved? Was it a compassionate gesture from someone? Was it with a stranger? Why are you so grateful for this event? And take a moment. Now, what I want you to do is begin to think about did you tell someone about it? So have you told anyone about this grateful event that you've experienced? If not, and also I respect everyone's privacy. So if you want to share what that grateful event was, right? And I would love for you to do it in the chat section and share what was that grateful event, and also share how it made you feel. I literally had a grateful event before I had my meeting with you guys today. I am addicted to Starbucks. I had to go and grab a coffee. What was wonderful is by the time I got to the counter, the young woman says, "Oh, the guy has already paid for your coffee." So I said, wow, this was beautiful. Small gesture from a stranger who I don't know. I don't know his name. I barely remember the car anymore. And then, of course, I paid for the person behind me. So it's about feeling that level of gratitude and thinking about really the level of emotions that you've gone through. And so I hope one of the things that you'll keep in mind, I know we're limited on time because usually my gratitude activities can be a little long, but I try to be really timely with this, is because I really want to walk you through, opposed to thinking, what am I grateful for? But begin to kind of savor the moment of what that looked like, how you felt, maybe even bringing yourself back there and really being able to experience and celebrate the goodness that you have in your world. So there's one positive activity for you to think about, and it's countless. Believe it or not, there are countless gratitude activities. That just happens to be one. The last time we had the call, I talked about my gratitude jar and how it can also be something that you can include within your family structure, so which is great. I love when I've talked to so many people in the industry that tell me how important gratitude is. And a matter of fact, a friend of mine who's an anchor shared with me how they kind of practice it within their newsroom structure. So gratitude can be a very powerful element for you to really consider and to include within your well-being strategy. Another element is mindfulness, helpful tips. And one of the things research suggests that mindfulness and meditation are really great for personal, interpersonal. They have a variety of different benefits in terms of helping us control emotion, helping us decrease rumination, right? So rumination would be that we're constantly thinking and worrying and going over and over again in our heads, but just slowing us down, it decreases that, improves our memory, which I always believe is great. And then also it really improves our awareness of our thoughts, which is also very beneficial. So something for you to keep in mind in terms of mindfulness. So another positive intervention, of course, we won't have time for us to go over that one today together, but it's something I want you to think about to conclude in terms of your self-care strategy, your well-being strategy, so to speak, is begin to slow down. Notice even when I talked about the gratitude activity, I try to take it into a slow motion, kind of savoring the moment. Of course, letting us kind of think through that. You can do that with other elements of your life. You can eat mindfully, right? You can think about, I'm gonna slow down. When I was reporting, I can recall days I didn't eat at all. And then I can recall days that I just shoved food in my mouth, trying to rush to make sure I got my scripts in. But what you want to do is you want to think about those times that you can really sit down, slow down, savor the moment, and not quickly going through it. Again, it's about kind of giving you that time to be reflective. Sitting mindfully. I love seeing this young man sitting mindfully, right? Thinking about your posture. How are you go about sitting? I'm thinking about as we speak, I'm sitting here talking to you. There's a level of excitement that I'm having talking to you guys, because you notice I wear a smile every time I speak, and I'm looking, because I kind of wear emotion, but I'm being also mindful that I just am treasuring the value of the moment. It's about being in the moment. And then also mindful breathing. There's also great breathing exercises that you can find on YouTube that will help you really think about the value of slowing down in terms of even your breath. Other positive activities you think about to include in your strategy, self-guided meditation. I live by it. I tell you, I thought to myself a few months ago, I'm like, wow, I'm not sleeping very well. And I go, oh, I have been doing my self-guided meditation. It really helps, centers me. So I highly recommend identifying self-guided meditation online. Also, of course, Dr. Harris talked about this as well, the value of exercise, movement. There's a great book talking about burnout. And one of the things that the scholars highly recommend is the importance of movement. And that can be in terms of exercise. It could be in terms of dance. It could be in terms of moving around your space. But think about that movement and they call it moving through the stress cycle. Also meaningful experiences. Think about things that you can do with your family that is all about positive activities with them. And I will say this, I won't give you specifics on that, because what I want you to do is I really want you to kind of create your own social experiment and begin to think about what is meaningful to you and what you can construct within your own life or have maybe in the past, and you need to bring it back. Right? You need to think about, I haven't done this in a while. Let me bring it back. It was something that really centered me, and it's something that also allowed me to enjoy elements of the people around me. All of these are great ways to really make sure you're maintaining happiness, because as you notice, that part of what I'm sharing is not only understanding the value in terms of valuing positive emotion, but also being able to be present and savor those moments. Also, I want to just reiterate what Dr. Harris said, that help is here. If you're finding that, well, you know what, Dr. Alston, Dr. Courtney, I've done all these things, I'm still not feeling myself, I'm still kind of going through all these different thoughts, understand that help is here, that professional help, therapy is such an important and really impactful way of treatment. I talk about it freely. I've shared it within, not only talking about it within my TED Talk, but I publicly talk about it a lot because I think it's important as an African-American woman and as someone who is a happiness scholar to share how much I value therapy. That when I was a reporter in Philadelphia and I became a widow at 25 and my late husband's death made news and we were only married 86 days, guys, my therapist was so key in helping me get through and really helping me being able to deal with so many different dynamics of work, of a newfound status, and then also dealing with not only the loss of him, but at the time my mother was diagnosed with cancer 3 weeks before my wedding to him. So it was a lot that I was dealing with on a job, and a lot that I was dealing with also in my personal life. So I'm going to leave you with this. It's a quote to live by. And it's from Dr. Christian Nith, who's one of the leading scholars as it relates to self-compassion. And she says, having compassion for yourself means you honor and accept your humanness. I hope you honor and accept your humanness and listen to what you need. And don't be afraid to create this social experiment for yourself. Don't be afraid to also incorporate some of these positive interventions, and also be intentional as it relates to creating a well-being strategy. The most important job you have is your health, your well-being.
Carrie, I hope that you could give us some insights on what's happening around us and how journalists can take care of themselves, and like what you're seeing from the standpoint of working at the Carter Center, which is encouraging of covering mental health. And I feel like not just this discussion tonight, but a part of our duty as journalists, we have a twofold duty. We have to take care of ourselves, but we also have to do a good job with news and information and relaying the importance of mental health, which I appreciated Dr. Harris zoning in on the word wellness, because that was intentional for me to put that in the title. So it was really interested in your thoughts on where we are, and yourself as a journalist as well, now working to elevate issues such as the ones we're talking about tonight. What are some tips or some reflections or insights that you have?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. I think one of the things that we tend to not realize is the impact of some of the traumatic stories that we're telling, and some may seem to be daily quick turn stories, like a fatal car accident where we think, okay, the trauma isn't that huge, that's just a regular story, and then we get thrust into the current political situation and the pandemic, and now and the protests, and dealing with racism in our own newsrooms and in our industry and the people that we cover. And I've worked with teams long enough where I understood the importance of looking out for teams' mental health. And so the thing that I'm seeing right now is that a lot of our programming is based around effectively reporting on mental health so that it doesn't propagate stigma. But what I've found in the past several months is that we've had to take a hard look at our programming and what the needs of journalists actually are. And the thing that I keep hearing again and again is that journalists need mental health support. Journalists need mental health resources. And also, you know, there is stigma within the industry as a whole in terms of getting help and in terms of talking about getting help. I think it's gotten better, but we still have a long way to go. And I think particularly in the Black community, there's stigma around that. I'm a Black immigrant, and talking to my parents about living with depression was a whole TED talk, literally. So, you know, before we get into the Q&A, I want to echo what Dr. Harris and Dr. Alston said, which is, you know, there are going to be days that we'll wake up and we will not feel like working that day. And to make space for those feelings if we can. And if that's not a day that we can turn off, to find an opportunity to turn off to do that, because that's really important. And if we, you know, we feel this added layer of responsibility as Black journalists to elevate voices like ours, and that means that we're almost always on more than our coworkers, and the importance of taking that time to turn off, because, and I said this on our last call, if you don't turn off, if you don't make that decision to take care of yourself in even small ways, then your body will make that decision for you. And so before you get to that point and you're no good to anyone, to your family, to yourself, to the community, to the newsroom, take that step back and be okay with taking that step back, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to do your job as effectively as you need to. And so I want to urge everyone on this call to really think about what are some small ways that I can make myself feel better, whether that is music or going for a walk or meditation. It looks different for everyone. But find that space for yourself and take that space. You have to claim it. Nobody's going to give it to you. And take care of yourself, because I know that our voices are needed more than ever. And so I want to thank Dr. Alston and Dr. Harris and Sarah for putting this together. And I want to turn it back over to them, because last time we had some great conversation and great questions about how we can really make a difference in our newsrooms, but in our own lives, and take care of ourselves. And I would love to hear from our mental health experts on that, and from you as well. So thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It is great to be back with you and back with Courtney as we discuss what is a very important issue, and I know is critical for the journalism community. You know, I have had the opportunity over the course of my career, really as chair of the AMA's opioid task force, to meet with journalists to talk about how you all cover that issue. And it was a great learning opportunity for me and a great opportunity to share information. But tonight, it's more of an individual and journalist check-in. But I do want to say, I just want to thank you, because, you know, as a physician, I know, and we have been focused on this during the course of this pandemic, the need to focus on science and evidence and the data. But listen, I am aware, well aware, that it's the narratives that really get to the heart of the story. And so I thank you all for your work in the narrative piece, helping us bring the science and the evidence and the data to life, because really it's the stories and the narratives that move people to action. As Sarah mentioned, I had the opportunity to participate on another one of these. So this is my second. And after the first call, I was just thinking, or it actually struck me on the call, how much in common physicians have with journalists. particularly during this time, but really all of the time, because here we are in the midst of our work, right, which is emotional, hard, sometimes gut-wrenching, and we have to some degree, take ourselves out of the story, right? We have to be objective. And so I know that we share that in common, because that is not always easy to do. And especially when, as Black journalists and Black physicians, we have a unique lens to tell that story. And if we don't tell that story through that lens, no one else will. And so I want to say, first of all, that there is no roadmap for this, particularly around this time with what I call the triple threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, racism, which is both acute and chronic, and of course, the recent episodes of police brutality. And of course, that is on a foundation of these things happening and being in existence for a long time. And so there is no roadmap for us, and it's important that we get together. I know we do as physicians, and you are having this call tonight to be supportive of one another. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we, as Sarah said, can, first of all, give grace and space to ourselves. Each one of us is unique and different, and we are experiencing this moment. We experience all moments in our unique way. We bring our own past, our own unique lens and vision, experience, expertise, actually to every situation, but particularly this situation. But we have to make sure that we give ourselves the grace and space to feel whatever we are feeling. How I am managing through this will be different than Courtney, will be different from Sarah. And it's so important that we allow ourselves to feel and not compare. Oh my goodness, should I be feeling this way? I'm not feeling this way. And my peer is feeling this way. I think the key thing is to be individual and give yourself that grace and that space to feel however you are feeling. And second, we need to name and identify those feelings, which is for some hard. And I know Courtney will help us and do some exercises on that a little bit later, but we should name how we're feeling. And sometimes that may require getting someone else to help us name those feelings and identify those feelings or our challenges or what we are angry about, right? So this is not just our feelings, but what are we angry about at this moment? And again, it's important to name it. And that, I think, helps drive the next step, which is action as well. Clearly, and tonight is one example, it's important to develop your own squad. It cannot, none of us can get through this crisis or actually any crisis alone. And it's very important to develop your own squad, to check in on a regular basis. And I always say to routinize that, because I think we get into a habit of thinking that we only need to check in or seek help or go to the doctor when there is an acute problem. But I think we should get into a habit of routinizing, checking in, routinizing, looking at our mental health. Of course, I hope everyone on this call goes in for your regular medical checkups. I mean, the idea is to be proactive. And so if we make it routine, hopefully it won't seem out of the ordinary, and it won't seem like there's necessarily a problem or it is a problem or a moral failing or a weakness to check on our mental health and certainly to ask for professional help. Please find a squad. Each one of us has our own squad. Find a squad to help you with that. The next point I'd like to make is, and I received this question on the last call, how do you know when to ask for help? So I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, it is absolutely okay, as I said, to be proactive and not be in the habit of only asking for help when something is, and I'll do the air quotes, wrong. But certainly we are all busy, and we may not, for many reasons, be able to routinize that, or at least have a routine that we would like. But absolutely, at this moment in time, here are some areas to think about if you think you need to ask for help beyond your squad, right? Are you sleeping at night? Or is your sleeping disrupted to the point where you are unable to function, and function either in your work or function in your relationships, or your ability just to enjoy, just to have a good time, to debrief, to decompress? So if you are having challenges in those areas, that is the time absolutely to be able to seek out professional help. Now, I will say there are partners in that because for far too long, our mental health system in this country has been under-resourced, and we don't have a strong mental health infrastructure, and we really need to work on that. And I know that many of you on this call in your community take time out in your work to um, elevate and amplify the fact that we have for decades underfunded and under-resourced our mental health infrastructure. And so there is a contract there, I think, with our larger society to make sure that those who need help can get the help that they need. I know that I am, as a child psychiatrist, I have seen over the last decade an increase in the number, unfortunately, of suicides in young African Americans, particularly young African American boys and teenagers. And so we certainly need to make sure that we amplify that, and that there is a place for folks to go if they feel a need for professional health. Sarah talked about action. And that is the key. So what do you do with all of this? And I think the key thing, and again, that will be individual, and there's individual action, whether or not you seek help, individual action around your family and your workplace. And then some of you may be called and feel a call to action, either personally or professionally, a larger call to action to make changes in where we are today. And those are just a few ways that we can take the feelings that we are feeling, the frustration, the anger, and move that to action. I want to say one thing about stress. Well, before I end with talking a little bit about stress, I want to talk about self-care. Sarah mentioned that, and that is very critical. And here, you not only call on your squad, but you call on your own individual ways that you've been coping: prayer, meditation, yoga, exercise, eating right, all of these issues. It's trite, and we hear it all the time. When we used to travel on airplanes, we were told to put our mask on first before helping others. And so it is very critical that we practice self-care. I want to say one last thing about stress and then resilience. Stress, not all stress is bad. There is good stress. There's a stress that we had when we had exams in college, and that stress motivated us to study for the exams. Then along the continuum, further along the continuum, there is tolerable stress. And again, individuals will tolerate stress differently. But we are and do encounter situations where the stress is long lasting. It's not just a short term, I have to study for the exam, maybe the death of a family member or something, where the stressor is more long lasting. But if we have a good, stable, nurturing environment around us, we can get through that stress. But the last thing I think we need to name and identify is toxic stress. And we need to name and identify racism as toxic stress. These are prolonged stressors that are not day-to-day stressors. And they cause our body to react. Of course, we react to those individual short-term stressors. But when we are confronted with these long-term, day in and day out stressors and trauma, it can truly take a toll on us, both our physical health, as regards high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, but also our mental health as well. But the news is not all bad. I've been asked a lot about the pending mental health crisis, and am I worried about that? And of course, I'm worried about that, but a crisis is not inevitable, and we can and need to do all that we can to make sure that that crisis is not inevitable, because I think everyone on this call probably realizes this. We are a resilient group of people, right? And so, of course, resilience requires stable, nurturing environments, but we are resilient. And I think that that's what we should all hold on to as we navigate this time and as we navigate the time post-COVID. As we navigate our path forward through racism, it looks like that there is going to be an opportunity for change, but we will see. I am cautiously optimistic about that. But again, crisis is not inevitable. We are resilient. We should, though, call on help when we need it and participate in events like this to check in, to make sure that we are getting the support that we need. So I just wanted to open with those 30,000 foot comments, and I look forward to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am very honored to be here today and to be able to talk to all of you as it relates to building a resilient newsroom. And Dr. Harris gave some great information that is really going to serve in terms of our overall well-being. And I look forward to talking about what that looks like in terms of a newsroom perspective, but then also the dynamics of really what a resilience looks like and what a resilient newsroom looks like. So let's get started talking about really the value of ally. And I usually always start with a quote, but this time I wanted to start with an image. And I thought this was really a great image. It was very timely. It talks about the value of ally, but what I love so much about it is that it says ally is a verb, really, right? In terms of an action, the state of being. And I love this in terms of the fact that sharing allies are more than just to survive. Allies are to help people thrive. And so I think that's the value of really the importance of allyship, and also, to be very honest, the value and the importance of resilience. So let's talk a little bit more about allyship and really what it means to be an ally, right? So we know that it is a verb, right, in terms of action. But I will say this, Power Shift Project has done a wonderful job, and specifically Jill Geisler, in addressing this topic. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, to actually go to the Freedom Forum Institute, their website, and look up some of the great work that Jill Geisler is doing in this area. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually utilize her definition of what an ally is and really what that means. And really what I really value about Jill is really her place in the industry in terms of being an executive and the great work that she's been doing in terms of training as it relates to newsrooms. And she actually speaks about allyship as this: an ally is a trusted force for good, which is really an important indicator as it relates to the importance and the value of ally. And the essential elements are really trusted, force, and good. So that speaks to the value of allyship. But really, to talk about it even more at length, she's done a phenomenal job in terms of creating this really great checklist of giving us indicators as it relates to what allyship means, what we can go about, and what it looks like. And what is also really important to share is that an allyship, or being an ally, is something that is really, like she says, it's not simply isn't a hero. An ally is a helper. And so within this checklist, she talks about the value of your knowledge in terms of allyship, what you do know about the historic and the issues related to inequity. So it's really important to build your knowledge base. And if it's something that you're still learning, this is a wonderful opportunity to really be able to dive in and to learn. Your willingness to listen and to be open-minded, right, in terms of that learning process, in terms of getting to know others and what that looks like. Your unselfishness, right, in terms of understanding this topic, and then also being able to gain the trust of others as it relates to allyship. And then also your track record in terms of supporting others as it relates to these life experiences, not only from your own, but really who may lack the advantages and privileges, right, that you may enjoy. So if you're a person on this call that's thinking about what can I do, allyship is a great opportunity to start thinking about what you can do in terms of the action of being able to serve. And as she mentioned, that allyship is a trusted force for good. So I also wanted to share some of the great work of other scholars. And Dr. Jacob McWilliams and Darrell Boyds talking about the differences between allies, accomplices, and advocacy, I think is extremely vital and important. Just like Jill Geisler, they talked about how an ally acts and speaks on the behalf of really a marginalized or disadvantaged person or community. And that they also stress that it's not something that you claim, it's something that you receive, right? It's really that act in terms of doing. And the difference between that ally and then the accomplice, right? Their conceptualization are those who are in solidarity of the marginalized group, really actively working as it relates to the cause. And I love what they shared in terms of accomplices, because they said accomplices are those who find really kind of linked arm in arm in the streets as relates to that cause, bringing attention to the cause, really kind of formulating as part of the cause. And the difference between that accomplice and as well as an advocate, which we really talk a great deal about. The advocate, they said, actually, they actually conceptualized it as not as risky, but the advocate is someone who supports a person or community because of the work that they're doing, being in a position of power. And they kind of conceptualize that as maybe a person who's a director of an organization, who's keeping within the mission of that organization. That's about the advocacy of that group, right? So as we can see, the differences between the ally, accomplices, and advocacy, and really as it relates to what these different entities or individuals, or maybe even organizations, can do in terms of serving as relates to a cause. So understanding those dynamics are important, but then also understanding how well-being at work can really serve you. One of the elements happens to be in my area, which is positive psychology, and how positive psychology can really help and serve in this is because positive psychology is about the scientific study of strengths and optimal human functioning, and it enables individuals and organizations. Remember when we, at the beginning of the talk, talking about how allies can help you thrive? Well, positive psychology is about helping individuals and organizations thrive. The movement is about sharing more science with a mass audience, really applied science to really help you have a more meaningful and fulfilling life. And within that, resilience fits very perfectly within the dynamics of positive psychology. And resilience refers to how we kind of negotiate adversity to kind of maintain our well-being. And also, it's the psychological process of how we kind of draw from our strengths, right? Positive psychology is really a strength-based approach, and resilience is really how we kind of leverage and lean on our strengths in terms of us adapting to challenges. Dr. Harris talked about the value of resilience and how we are that resilient group, right? But then also it speaks to the value of how we bounce back. So resilience really focuses a lot on how we go about bouncing back, but then what are those individuals? What types of individuals are resilient individuals in terms of doing so? And that's another value in terms of positive psychology, is understanding what that looks like and how we can continue to leverage that. So when we're looking at the values of resilience at work, right, in terms of really the importance of it in terms of the workplace, in positive workplace relationships, a resilient worker really helps in terms of the achievement of success within either the individuals within that workplace or the organization. And they are a team player. They're a person that values and believes in a kind of a win-win approach, right, in terms of the value of the organization and what they can continue to do to not only really help the organization, but really looking at the value of individuals that make up the group. They believe and value and build strong connections and relationships with individuals. They're active listeners, which is a very important dynamic. They're people that are very open-minded, highly also empathetic, really individuals that understand the value of perspective taking, and understanding the importance of really making sure that they're present and being mindful of the individuals that are part of their team. So there's a lot of different great dynamics to the value of being a resilient worker, but also really having the culture of resilience in the workplace. So there's a prescription, literally, as it relates to the value of resilience at work. And these scholars have come up with really a phenomenal kind of grid, so to speak, as it relates to what that prescription as it relates to resilience at work looks like. I will kind of briefly discuss them, but really start to dive in a little bit more on how it can really apply in terms of newsrooms and the importance as relates to the industry. Of course, positive attitude is very important, having that optimistic frame. Role models really serves, right? Because I think that's another important indicator of being that presence, but then also modeling, looking at what some other organizations are doing is important in terms of facing fears. So if you're a workplace that's welcoming in the importance of resilience, right? It's certainly about facing what's going on there. It's not about kind of hiding and ignoring and being silent, right? It's really making some noise and facing it. Understanding coping skills, which Dr. Harris talked about a little bit earlier as relates to her presentation, but understanding the importance of those coping skills. Resilient workers really understand the value of not only making sure that they're serving their teams, they understand the importance of serving themselves, that they're nurturing as relates to their own self-care, as well as making sure that they are kind of serving as active participants within the organization. Also, supportive networks. It's important to have that component within developing a resilient workplace. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Training is also important. So this call is, is really phenomenal in regards to the fact that all of you are here and you are really actively participating in terms of making sure that you are giving yourself all that you need, right, in terms of maintaining and building and developing your self-care. But also the regular training within organizations is also very important, that more organizations begin to have conversations like this one, right? And training like this one in terms of an executive level as well as the entire organization to really be able to develop these skills valuing a resilient workplace. Then also signature strengths. Within positive psychology, there are 24 value and action character strengths that we utilize and leverage within the field. One of them happens to be courage. I think there's a great sense of courage in regards to having a resilient workplace. I also believe is a great sense of courage for an individual who becomes an ally or accomplice, right, and is doing advocacy. There's a great level of courage in all of that as it relates to the value of resilience. So let's talk about a little bit about what this may look like within a news organization, right? We already talked about that prescription, so to speak, as relates to resilience in the workplace. Within a news organization, social support can play a very important role in terms of workplace resilience, guidance and support during times of stress, especially as relates to nurturing those relationships. Remember, it's about making sure that we're having a level of compassion at work, during the first call, I talked about the value of compassionate news organizations and how that will really serve. Well, also that speaks to that in terms of the value of creating these support systems within organizations and coming from the top, and then also within individuals within the newsrooms as well. Then also remember that resilient employees are able to manage stress effectively, like all of you are doing on this call, in terms of finding out what you can utilize and leverage to help kind of maintain your well-being. That's also a really great indicator in regards to being able to manage your stress, but then also actively taking part in self-care to kind of nurture yourself, as well as being able to nurture others within your organization. I will tell you this, when I was a news director and I did a fellowship with the National Association of Broadcasters, I think one of the best advice they gave me was when it came down to thinking about how to be effective leader for your team. And one of the things that they shared was, when you're on the plane and you're talking about, getting that mask on, and if you want to help other individuals, well, the first person you need to put the mask on is for yourself, right? To be able to serve the other individuals that are part of, the plane. And so it's so important to make sure that on a management standpoint, managers are making sure that they're taking care and doing self-care, but it's also very important in terms of the organization within all the dynamics of all the individuals to make sure that you are nurturing your well-being. Remember, that is really your most important job is regards to your health and your well-being. So let's take a look at another component that will serve in terms of building a resilient newsroom or news operation. I'm sure many of you have heard a lot about emotional intelligence. We're strengthening emotional intelligence, really that emotional insight will allow an awareness of a full range of emotions from negative into positive, right? Because understanding your own intelligence level as it relates to your emotions is also ideal in terms of being able to understand others around you and the reactions and the actions of others, and also the social cues of others. Also in terms of understanding how to be empathetic, how to effectively communicate. And so all of this is very important. And as well as the fact that dealing with levels of emotional intelligence is dealing with a level of self-awareness, and then also understanding the value and the importance of trust, right? Because that is also very important as relates to how to go about building relationships within an organization. It's hard to have people really feel safe without building a level of trust, right? And so that's also another important component. I will tell you this, doing some of the research as relates to thinking about how to construct a resilient newsroom, I came across some great work as it relates to allyship that I thought would be ideal in terms of bringing in terms of the value of emotional intelligence. And one of the elements was, in terms of allyship, they talked about speak up, but not over. I think that also speaks to a level of self-awareness, right? Is individuals understanding, especially if you're trying to be an ally within an organization, is the value of speaking up, but allowing individuals to share, because remember, a big part of that dynamic is a level of learning and being open-minded and really getting to know. So another essential component in terms of building a resilient newsroom. So this is a third one, and that is, once all of these different dynamics are constructed, right? These are some of the main dynamics in terms of thinking about a newsroom, and then also the prescription of how to build a resilient workforce. It's important that we do a follow-up, a debriefing, right, in terms of these sessions. And I think that's also important, not only on an organizational level, but it's also important on an individual level. As you're going through elements of self-care and thinking about all the things that you're doing to nurture yourself and creating hopefully some level of balance, or thinking about how to go about building resilience within yourself and then your team, you want to go and be reflective. And this is the moment where you can look back and see not only how, if you're a manager, how an employee coped, but then if you're an individual, well, how you kind of weathered the storm. What worked, what didn't work, what can be done differently, kind of some lessons learned, and then also giving an opportunity to develop some action, really, and kind of a solutions-oriented approach in terms of developing some action plans as relates to what needs to be done and what is working and what can be constructed to really build a solid, resilient organization. So with saying all of that in terms of building the resilience as it relates to your team and yourself, right? Remember some of the tips shared earlier, but then also just reiterating some of the tips that have been shared in previous sessions, especially if you happen to miss it, but the importance of the value of self-care. Remember, in order for us to be able to serve others, we have to kind of, make sure that we're exercising levels of self-care. One of my mentors said something that I always remember. I'm always thinking about my cup. She says, Courtney, you want to give from your saucer, not your cup. Meaning, if I'm doing due diligence in terms of my own self-care and I'm filling my cup, right, then I can give from my saucer. But if I'm giving from my cup and it's looking a little empty, that means I need to go and be reflective and think about what I need in terms of my own well-being. These are some things for you to keep in mind. Power down. You may find yourself needing that time to remove yourself, especially as if you're dealing with levels of racial stress, right? And in order to kind of handle it, you might need to be a little reflective and to power down for a moment. Also think about positive activities, things that are going to really increase positive emotions. In the past, I've talked about the value of gratitude and practicing gratitude, and because it allows you to be reflective, but also allows you to be present. Then self-compassion, thinking about what you need and the importance of that. Remember, because it starts with self, and that's in terms of an individual standpoint and a management standpoint. Positive relationships. Dr. Harris talked about the self-care squad. Guys, it's so important to be able to have that and identify people who truly are people that are positive, right? Because what you don't want is to have someone that's a part of your self-care squad that lacks empathy, lacks certain levels of compassion, and then you find yourself, feeling maybe worse than you did when you initially spoke to them, right? So be very selective in terms of qualifying positive relationships. Be mindful. So eat mindfully, sitting mindfully, breathing mindfully. All of these elements are important in terms of having a level of mindfulness, which means when you're out covering a story and you find yourself, I used to do this a lot. I found myself kind of throwing down food and not having a chance to really enjoy it. But now as a happiness scholar, I understand, no, I need to sit back for a moment if I have that time, right? Some moments are different than others. Sitting, making sure that you're thinking about your levels of even breathing is also important in terms of the practice of self-care. Self-guided meditations, I will tell you this, I live on YouTube, and mostly because of the fact I love that when you're searching for knowledge, and you can find so many things out there from various TED Talks with other experts sharing expertise, and then you will find great self-guided meditations as well. It's a great resource to be able to be present. The other day I was extremely stressful and I said, okay, I need to start meditating. Started meditating for about 45 minutes and my mood shifted. So think about these different mindful approaches as it relates to how to go about practicing self-care. Dr. Harris talked about the importance of exercise and movement is really important in terms of burnout. Research supports that in terms of kind of working through the stress cycle. And then meaningful experiences. So think about the things that serve you, and it looks different for all of us, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I always say, welcome to having a social experiment with your life, to understand the dynamics of how to go about looking for things that are about positive emotions, understanding the various levels of well-being, but then thinking about what works for you, right? I just told you something that really works for me, and that's meditation. Well, find out and something that works for you and don't be afraid to kind of experiment to see what that looks like. So I'm going to end it on this note, and this is the importance of a quote that I really think will really serve us all, and that is, when we learn how to become more resilient, we learn how to embrace beautifully broad spectrum of human experiences. Guys, I hope this serves you in terms of not only embracing your own human experience, but then all those who are there who are thinking about becoming allies, accomplices, and the advocacy work that you're doing in terms of really creating change to make a difference. Please make sure, no matter what, that you're thinking about what you need as relates to your self-care and really your well-being.
So again, thank you all for taking the time to participate in this series of sessions, the first of which was with Dr. Sarah Vinson, Mr. Rodney Tresley, and Dr. Alston, and then we segued and included Dr. Patrice Harris, in addition to Dr. Alston for the most recent sessions. But what we were able to accomplish in this journalist wellness check-in call series was that we were able to unpack what we're all going through right now as members of the media, documenting from a pandemic which happened to the magnitude of the one we're experiencing once in a lifetime. So to be under that purview of a journalist, a media professional, thrust into covering a once in 100-year medical event and crisis in our country, to then, just 3 months later, for us as a citizenry to witness one of our fellow citizens narrate his own death, George Floyd, at the hands and, quite frankly, the knee of a now former Minnesota and specifically Minneapolis police officer. So we have certainly witnessed quite a bit of trauma, and our jobs are never without stress and duress, but this is a unique time. And so we came together as a community of journalists to not only figure out strategies to how to get through this difficult time, but to figure out strategies to not just be effective at work and manage the stress that we're witnessing, but secondarily, but also I think as we learn getting through this series, even more importantly, how to take care of ourselves and recognize self-care as the pinnacle of the focus that we need to interject into our lives as working professionals and journalists. And that hopefully coming out of this series, we've sparked a lot of new ways of thinking and strategies that we can take back and implement in our own professional lives and career. And then finally, that we kind of equipped each other with insights that we can take back to our newsrooms and our management teams to help further positively impact change in our own newsrooms. So I am grateful for everyone's time and attention. I'm grateful for the nearly 250 or so people that registered for these sessions, and hopefully through your future inquiry, we'll be able to maybe reconvene again in the future. If I or anyone a part of this series can be of help, don't hesitate without question to reach out. The video presentations will be available, and so we will be able to then continue this conversation in perpetuity, because you'll be able to share it with your own colleagues and go forth. So with that, happiness was our password for this last call, and that really, I think, is where I want to leave things, is that I hope that happiness can be your goal in your personal lives and your professional lives, and that we are going to take care of each other and check in on each other regularly so that we all can work to that end. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and do stay in touch and do help each other and one another, because we are certainly all in this together. So thank you all.